Ancient Greek word order. Is it subject, object, verb like Latin? Or is it subject, verb, object like English or modern Greek? Is this even the right question? You see, ancient Greek word order is free, meaning it's flexible, meaning that the native speakers who once spoke the language were able to move around nouns and verbs and other parts of speech in order to emphasize them. But if they could emphasize the words by moving them around, that means there had to have been some sort of a default word order, an unmarked word order, a neutral word order. Well, what was that word order? For anybody who studies Greek, it's kind of like being out in the cold and slipping around on the ice. You're not really sure exactly why this word is here and that word is there. But we have learned exactly what that is. At least we have a pretty good idea. Believe it or not, for a very long time, our understanding of ancient Greek word order wasn't very clear and only has recently matured. In this video, I'll show you a very practical, indeed a highly pragmatic approach to bring much needed order to the apparent syntactic chaos of ancient Greek. I'm Luke, and this is polýMATHY. And that's a chickadee. So what is that default word order in ancient Greek? Well, let's go a little bit broader. What is the tendency of the word order in ancient Greek? I'll tell you right away, it is to put towards the beginning of the sentence, in that leftmost position, the more important, more emphasized bits of information. And the more presupposed, the more obvious, the more predictable pieces of information go towards the end of the sentence, or phrase, by the way, as we shall see. The most interesting thing is because of that, we often have the verb very close to the beginning of an ancient Greek sentence, and not towards the end, as we tend to have in the Latin sentence. In this video, I'll be concentrating on classical Greek, especially classical Attic. Although Koine, or Kini in the modern Greek pronunciation, Koine literature also shows, it seems, the basic information I'm going to tell you about in this video when it comes to the word order in ancient Greek. That said, I'm also going to be using the classical Attic pronunciation in this video. And if you want to learn more about that, this video will definitely give you a good primer, as well as the change of the pronunciation of ancient Greek through the centuries. So here's the kind of question we might encounter at the beginning of Plato's Crito. Socrates says, "Tite nikade apixai, o Kriton." So why is the verb at the end of that phrase? You arrived, apixai. Could it come before? What about another that comes a bit later? Taumazdo hopos tele sesui. Why is the verb taumazdo at the beginning of that phrase? What's going on here? What's the answer? So in this video, I'll be referencing a number of famous authors like Xenophon and Plato and Herodotus. But wouldn't it be great if you could just read these authors in the original already? And if you want to do that, then this video sponsor, the Ancient Language Institute, is a great way that you can learn, acquire the ancient Greek language with the direct method. At Ancient Language Institute, we use this direct method to teach you how to read, because that's the point, right? We want to be able to read this literature, and you'll be able to do that in our classes, interacting with your teachers, responding to questions in ancient Greek that are posed to you. You'll be starting to think in ancient Greek. We're going to stimulate you to think that way, as well as in Latin and Old English and Biblical Hebrew. Registration for the summer term closes on April 12th, and that's when we'll have new cohorts starting for all 4 of our languages. But if you actually do know some ancient Greek or Latin or Old English or Biblical Hebrew, well, we have intermediate and advanced classes as well as tutoring sessions. So if you sign up for one of our courses, you'll have at your fingertips a huge amount of resources that will give you everything you need to succeed. All you need to do is bring the desire and the commitment. We'll bring the rest. There's also a Latin teacher summer boot camp available, and you should check out on the website ancientlanguage.com for that and to sign up for your next course. Now, when it comes to this word order question, there are different ways that we can approach it. And these two approaches are called syntactic and pragmatic. Well, what is the syntactic approach? What is the pragmatic approach? In a recent video, I talked about Latin word order, and I may even reference Latin word order in this video. Sorry, Hellenists, but it is useful sometimes to compare ancient Greek to Latin, and I think this is one of those cases. Well, the syntactic word order, as I discussed in the video about Latin word order, that is what I proposed there, and that was a reading of many different prose composition books, especially from the late 19th and early 20th century. And the notion there of the syntactic default word order of Latin is that the subject is first maybe preceded by some kind of time expression or other kind of thing that gives a sense or a setting or something like that. But then the subject's real close to the front, and the verb is at the end in the most default, unmarked, unemphasized word order. And then the other stuff is in between. Other things like direct object and indirect object and adverb. When we use those terms, subject, verb, object, maybe direct object or indirect object, adverb, predicate, all those different things, those are all terms associated with the syntactic approach to understanding word order in a language. But linguists have been shifting in their scientific understanding of languages and word order in particular to a pragmatic approach over the past several decades. And it's very useful too. We'll talk more about the pragmatic approach as it applies to Latin a little bit later in the video and only just touching on it. And this comes down to precision and utility. One can in fact use the pragmatic word order to describe Latin as well, giving us very similar results. Because what we're trying to do is get a theoretical framework of how all this works. Like I told you before, in the Latin word order, you have this basic syntactic word order. And when that order is changed, it's for some kind of emphatic reason, usually, or for some kind of rhythmical or euphonic reason and so forth. The problem with the syntactic approach with respect to ancient Greek is it doesn't seem to work. It breaks down far more than it does with Latin. With Latin, it seems to be pretty okay, and some pragmatic considerations tend to help refine some things, but the syntactic word order, that is, here's the question, right? Is ancient Greek a subject, object, verb language like Latin seems to be in its default unemphasized form? Or is it a subject, verb, object language? Which is, of course, typical of modern Greek, for example? Well, no, it's neither. Ancient Greek is not like modern Greek, and it's not like Latin. It does not follow those syntactic patterns at all very much. And I may bring them up again, and it's worth doing that with a great deal of caution, because the pragmatic approach, which I still haven't told you what it is, but I promise I will, is yet much better. So what is the pragmatic approach? Well, this takes into consideration many important pieces of information. The verb is one of them and its position, but much more important is something called topic and focus. So when you hear terms like topic and focus, we're talking about a pragmatic approach to understanding the word order of a language, as opposed to the syntactic approach, which is subject, object, verb, etc. Now, I've reviewed a number of sources that discuss word order in ancient Greek, including and especially pragmatic approaches to it, and what I'm going to give here is a summary of some of what I think is the clearest idea of how the word order works. And what I'm really focused on here to try to convey to you is a default word order, so that when you see this word order isn't being used, the author is trying to do something, to emphasize something, maybe subtly, maybe slightly, maybe profoundly, maybe right in your face, like this is the thing you're supposed to look at. That's why the word order is different. Here on the screen are some of the resources that I consulted. I'd also like to thank my friend, the linguist Danny Bate, who told me about a few of them. In fact, Danny Bate, he runs a podcast called A Language I Love Is, and he actually interviewed me for it. That interview hasn't come out as of when I'm recording this video, but he did interview my friend and colleague, Colin Gorey, if you want to hear that podcast episode. In any case, we should get to an example. Let's do a nice Platonic example, right? How about the very beginning of Lysis? Well, that goes like this. Eporeomen men ex academias eotu lukeu ten exotekos bautotokos. Okay, what do we notice here at the very beginning? The verb. Very interesting. Now, what this sentence is demonstrating to us is something called the broad focus. And I find this easier to understand if you are talking about something kind of out of the blue, like you're starting to tell a story. In this case, Socrates is speaking. He's saying, I was traveling from the academy right to the Lyceum by means of the way, the than, that's why it's feminine, by means of the way that's outside the wall, just underneath the wall. Okay, so there you go. But the really important and interesting thing here is he's starting this sentence with a verb. Why is he starting with a verb? Because, well, there's no other context. We could insert the ego pronoun. Of course, the ancient Greek language is a pro-drop language, meaning that the pronoun, when it's a subject pronoun, can be just dropped freely because we don't need it unless we have the need to specify a subject by name, though we can add it in, and we'll talk about that. It would go if it were needed to bring attention back to the fact that it's I who am speaking and it's something about me, to kind of bring back everything into the narrative. Then we could add ego, eporeomen ego, ex academias. But the most significant thing here is the verb is at the beginning. That's what this broad focus is doing. What is the broad focus here? It's primarily the verb. That's what we're focusing on. A little bit later, though, we have a question from Hippothales. He says, Poi de poreuei, kai poten. Where are you going to and where from? Whither and whence, right? So poi and poten. Very common colloquial phrase in Attic, right? So what does Socrates respond? Ex academias poreuomai, eutu lukeu. This is very interesting. It is a different word order than we saw before. We have a question, poi poten, so whither and whence. Ex academias poreuomai. We have the question, poten, whence, from where? And he says, ex academias poreuomai. The verb is not first. Well, what's going on here? This is called narrow focus. We are narrowly focusing on an answer to a specific question. Poten, whence? Ex academias, from the academy. And then the verb follows. So narrow focus and broad focus are the two general schemes. What is most critical is, in fact, the position of the verb, or rather, everything around the verb, as if the verb is the center of the universe of the phrase. So in a broad focus sentence, we have the verb. The verb is the focus, and other things can go along with that focus. For example, ex academias, from the academy, and the other stuff about the direction he was going and so forth. In this schema, in this scheme here for the broad focus clause, it's a little bit like an algebra formula. Who doesn't love algebra? That's why we're studying ancient Greek, right? To get into algebra. So the verb is really critical. The broad focus is the verb plus some other things. And then there's this other thing called given topic, or a contrastive, or new topic, or a recurring topic that go before. Well, I mentioned that the pronoun ego, which goes with this word, eporeomen, I was traveling, I was going, right? Well, where would that go? The most unemphasized position for that would be after the verb. Eporeomen ego. But if Socrates here wanted to contrast his traveling with where someone else was going, maybe where Hippothales was going, well, then he could say, well, Hippothales is going there. Ego de, using that lovely de, which is so useful for contrastive. Well, a contrastive topic goes, as we know, right at the beginning of the sentence with de, because of course we all know ancient Greek, right? And these de, those expressions go towards the front. So ego de eporeomen ex academias and so forth. So I, on the other hand, was going from here to there. So that is where that contrastive stuff would go. Now, this supports what I said at the beginning, which is my very general observation about all of these pragmatic studies. The most important, emphasized, contrastive information goes at the beginning or towards the beginning, especially in relation to the verb. Thus, with this narrow focus response, the question poten, from where? Ex academias, poreuomai, from the academy. I am traveling, I am going, right? Here's another broad focus example. Epetume sehodareos desastais skutas. So we have what's here a given topic, which is between the two parts of the broad focus. The most significant part of a broad focus is the verb. Hence, the beginning of the phrase, the beginning of the sentence, the beginning of the clause is the verb. Epitume se hodareos de sastais gutas. So that is why the verb is at the beginning. And I am contending here, and this is supported by a number of the sources that I mentioned, I'm contending that this broad focus with the given topic that follows it, otherwise called the continuous topic, that's another term given for it, a topic which is either understood to be, we know we're talking about Darius in this sentence. This whole narrative is about Darius. We had an interjection for a second, but now we're getting back to Darius. Epitume se hodareos. The subject is coming after the verb. Now, that terminology, subject and direct object and all those things, that's loaded with syntactic approach philosophy, isn't it? Because it actually doesn't have to be the subject. It could be something else closely related to the verb and yet goes right there. So the way that we can approach it, if we want to think about, especially for use of the subject-object-verb, such as in Latin, or subject-verb-object, like English or modern Greek, these ideas that we understand that in a kind of way that works for us, that syntactic approach, the best solution I can give you is that the most unmarked word order in ancient Greek will start with a verb and then be followed by the subject, if the subject needs to be uttered at all. Just like in Latin, we don't necessarily need it if it's ego or hutos or something like that. Doing that, adding in dareos here, hodareos, or adding in a pronoun, eporeo man nego, it just brings us like all those other things were happening, and interjection, and then also me. But it's not contrastive, just bringing it back in. So what about the narrow focus, because that's going to deal with more emphasis, right? Well, here's an example from Aristophanes. Pui tu ton helkes. Whither this fellow you are dragging. Where are you dragging him off to? And that's the young woman. The old woman replies, E samaute se sago. To my own, meaning my own bed, e sago. I'm dragging him, I'm taking him. But it's interesting, the verb is changed because helkes, you're dragging him, which seems kind of violent. And she's like, oh, e sago. No, I'm just, taking him. And it's just, it's a very funny, strange comedy. But the point, of course, is the position of everything in relation to the verb. The narrow focus, e samautes, to my own, right? To my own, of my own house's place and bedchamber and so forth. That's the notion. So you have pui, that question word, and the response is right at the beginning. We can note that English can't do something like this, or very seldom will. Where are you taking him to? To my own house, I am taking him. We're not going to do that. That sounds weird. I'm taking him to my own house. Note that English seems to do the opposite, right? New, important, even contrast information, because that verb second rule is so important in English, more frequently will go towards the end of a sentence rather than at the beginning. So note that these three languages we've been talking about, English versus Latin versus ancient Greek, they all have very different ways to order their words and noun phrases, and verbs for that matter. So that is the main thing that's going on here. Pui, whither, e samautes. Narrow focus. What if we were to change the word order, say the word order of the response? Let's take it out of context. If it's a response, it's got to be this way with this question. Take more out of context, same basic elements. Old lady is saying, I'm taking the young man back to my place. So we change it, put the verb first. E sago, e samautes. I'm taking him to my place. Well, what does that do? What does that word order do? That's a broad focus type now, isn't it? Where we have that verb first. This would be typical of a narrative. If she's telling a story, let's say in the present tense, e sago, e samautes, e sago ton nean, e samautes, something like that. So that's just telling a story, just like when Socrates started with eporeo man, ex academias, and so forth. That's what that would be. But it just doesn't work in this situation because they have the question, poi tu ton helkes. What if we were to change the word order, though, the poi tu ton helkes, which is a very normal word order. What if we were to say, poi helkes tu ton? What that does is it reduces the emphasis on that word tu ton, meaning this guy who's you're dragging, I don't know, by the hair or the arm, or I assume he's unconscious. I don't remember what happens in the play. But the point is that if we were to put the tuton after the verb, poi helkes tuton, the fact that it's this guy is a given, more obvious, more predictable thing in this situation that I just invented here, because that's not the original. The original situation is poi tu ton helkes. The fact that you're dragging this guy, old lady, is utterly evident. But where? This guy. So the where is the most important thing. Whither, of course, to where, poi. And the tuton, this guy, that's also very important. Not maybe as important as the boy, but, that's very important. And then the head case, that's obvious and a given. Thus, if you were to put the tuton after, if you were already talking about this guy, and maybe you were doing different things to him, you were throwing water on him, you were feeding him, but different verbs, and so the tuton is obvious. But, now you're dragging, boy, head case, tuton. Then the tuton would go after. And so there'd be less shock about this particular fellow being mentioned of all the possible people in the world. So that's what changing the word order would do. And that's why the word order given is the one that makes the most sense in this context. Poi tu ton helkes. Most important thing, the whither, and then this guy, and then the dragging. That's pretty obvious. Esamautes, an answer to the question right at the beginning. Esago, and then a verb which is synonymous, pragmatically, if you will, with the helke. So it's the verb of what she's doing. It's just a nicer way of saying helko. I'm dragging. It's esago. I'm just taking him. Here's another narrow focus example. The context is that this sentence is part of a passage in which Xenophon lists several animals encountered in a plain through which the army is marching, and then he recounts how the soldiers hunted each of them, and so this sentence he discusses the ostrich among all these animals. So this is contrastive, right? This contrastive topic here. Struton de udehes elaben. As for the ostrich, however, no one caught. So the soldiers, they were hunting all these different animals, but as for the ostrich, no one caught it. The topic is the struton, and then the narrow focus is the udhes, and then the elaben. Now, differently from the others where we're asking questions, and then we're giving a narrowly focused answer to that very specific question, here we can kind of imagine, well, what about the ostrich? Did anybody catch an ostrich? Struton de udehes elaben. But we can also have contrasting topics, not just with a narrow focus, but also with a broad focus sentence. So in this sentence, Xenophon is describing how he dealt with the family of one of the army's guides. Xenophon is himself the given topic and is left unexpressed. So we're going to see in a second. The various members of the family head their clauses as contrastive topics. And in the first two clauses, we have broad focus constructions. Both the fact that Xenophon gave up his prisoners and the identity of the recipients are asserted. Tomen hegemona paradidos ikerisopoi. So we have a contrastive topic that precedes the broad focus. Again, broad focus, the verb, right? Verb, and anything else to do with the verb paradidosi, right? There's that verb. So tomen hegemona paradidosi. And then the next clause, again, clause, sentence, phrase are kind of interchangeable conceptually. Tous de oiketas katalepe toi komarkoi. So again, the unspoken given topic here is Xenophon. No pronoun is needed. If there were one, it would be after the verb. But that verb in the broad focus, right there beginning, katalepe toi komarkoi. But we have a contrastive topic because we're contrasting with the ton men hegemona in the first clause, and then the tous de oiketas, then the slaves, the servants, katalepe toi komarkoi, to the town leader, what's the chieftain, that sounds right. And then at the end of the whole sentence, the final clause, we have a narrow focus. So, tu tonde plestene ampipolitei, narrow focus there, right? And then the verb didosi, the verb, pulatin. That's all the rest of the sentence that follows. So the basic positions in the broad and the narrow focus, they're as you see here in these somewhat algebraic formulae, right? You have some kind of topic position that could be filled in the beginning, or maybe not. It would be a contrastive topic, a recurring topic, a new topic, right? Then you have the verb, right, in a broad topic situation, followed by the given topic, and then the rest of the things that go with that broad focus. Whereas in the narrow focus, we have a position for a contrastive or a new topic, and then a narrow focus, and then a verb, and then maybe some given topic that goes with that, and then the rest. Those are the two basic formulae. But there's only two positions in front of the verb. What if you have a sentence like this one? This is from Herodotus. Gyros mentuton to logon toisiosi, kai toisi aiuleusi, donde heneca elexe. Oti hoiones protoron autu gyru, de atentos, de angelon, abistastai speas, apokroisu, u capetonto. So the context is that Cyrus is saying this story to the Ionians and to the Aeolians in order to persuade them that, listen, this is what happened before, you should probably do what I say, and so forth. Anyway, so it's, and that is seen here in the second part, hoti hoi iones protoron uk epetonto, because the Ionians previously didn't obey. So that's what the donde heneca, that's going to be the focus, as we're saying. The donde heneca, that donde, what is about to be said, what is about to follow in the next phrase. So let's analyze this a little bit more. We have gyros, okay. We have a verb elexe, okay. We have the verb elexe. If stuff comes before the verb, it's emphasized, it's important, it's new, perhaps. It could even be recurring. So gyros is coming in, and now he is the new topic for sure. And then we have the donde heneca on account of the following elexe. What did he elexe? What did he say? He said tu ton logon. That comes before. So elexe tu ton logon. He said this story. He told this story. Donde heneca. This is, of course, Ionic dialect, not Attic, but it's still going to be certainly comparable. We're talking about classical Greek syntax here, right? Word order in classical Greek. So heneca. Donde heneca. So he told the story, donde heneca, because of the following. So we have a new or recurring topic, which is gyros, elexe, the verb, and then the narrow focus is donde heneca. All that's fine. If that's the case, what on earth is tu ton logon? And what is toisi, iosi, kai toisi, aiuleusi? That's another thing. Can we have more than one topic? Yes, we can. We can have more than one topic. Topic could be everything before the donde heneca, but it has different topic expressions. Gyros is one. That is a recurring topic because we're getting back to Cyrus doing or saying something about that whole story. So gyros, tu ton logon elexe. He told this story. Donde heneca elexe. For the following reasons he told it, right? And then we have another topic. To whom he was telling it, toisi iosi kai toisi aiuleusi, to the Ionians and to the Aeolians. So this word order works. In some ways it even kind of looks like a Latin word or potentially, but let that not distract us. That's not necessarily the reason the words are in this order in this clause. In fact, we can apply the same principle as before. That which is closer to the front, especially if it's before a verb, is somehow more important, more emphasized. So gyros, okay, getting back to what Kyros is talking about. Tu ton logon, that's the story that was just preceding. Toisi iosi kai toisi aiuleusi. That's almost unimportant, relatively speaking, right? Because we know that he was telling the story to the Ionians and the Aeolians. That's why it comes after the tu ton logon. Also, we can consider that tu ton logon, using that word tu ton, that's a preceding thing in the narrative. So that should rightly come closer to the beginning of the phrase. Whereas, donde, the following things, that should go aiming towards the end. And then elexe. The verb here is not the focus. The more important focus is the donde heneca. That's the big thing. And the verb is a little bit more predictable. So that is why that whole clause is phrased the way it is. Because you have a donde heneca, that should definitely be towards the thing that you want to talk about. Well, why couldn't it just be elexe, donde heneca? That would be more broad focused, right? Where you put the verb before. The fact that he told the story is not the focus. That's a given thing. That's a predictable thing. Yeah, tu ton logon elexe. We know that he said this story, that he told this story. But donde heneca, that's the focus. And that narrow focus comes before the verb. However, it is close to the clause that it's associated with for the following reason, which is hoti hoi iones protoron u capitonto. That is the thing that follows. That's why those are close together. So you're already seeing something else going on here, is that almost none of the word order that's going on in a sentence, this was also true in Latin for sure, and is true in a lot of languages that have flexible word order like this. The word order is very much affected by the surrounding sentences. what came before, what comes after, is going to attract and pull things one way or the other to make it all flow narratively. And that's still all true when it comes to emphasis, what is emphasized and what is not, but that narrative flow and what makes sense in this or that, sequentially connecting the one thing to another, is going to have a big impact. And what this will lead into, when one can get more sophisticated in one's understanding of all these things, are aspects of euphony and aspects of rhythm, where words are rearranged by every single one of the ancient authors in order to create these clausulae, to use the Latin term, these rhythmic clauses, especially towards the end of phrases, so that one, of course, avoids poetic meter, but uses the meter of prose rhythm. And all these authors do it. This is why learning phonemic vowel length and syllable length is a sine qua non. You can't actually fully appreciate the prose literature without knowing that and being able to recite these languages, ancient Greek and Latin, in that way, all the way up through, Plutarch in the 2nd century at least, as well as Apuleius, 2nd century for both Latin and ancient Greek very easily. So all of the really big, Koine and Latin literature falls into that category. So there are many, many things going on here. There could be a syntactic way of understanding the word order, where the subject comes after the verb in these unmarked sentences. That's terminology I'm using, and I think it's a very reasonable analysis. It's backed up by some of the authors I read here. But the pragmatic one is very effective. It's very useful for ancient Greek altogether. You have the things that are more emphasized and more important tend to go towards the front, and the things that are more given, they usually come after the verb. They come towards the end of the clause. And this works too for phrases that are not the main clause either. And all that said, getting back to what I asked towards the beginning of the video, these two sentences at the beginning of Crito, Tite nikade apixai. Why is the verb at the end of that clause? Why is it not sooner? Why, in English, why did you come so early? Right? Why did you come so early? We can hear the intonation in our voices. Like I talked about too in the Latin word order video, the word order in ancient Greek is what gives us a lot of the emphasis, along with the particles and so forth. All that is really important. In English, our intonation is what really carries the emphasis. Why did you come so early? These pretzels are making me thirsty.
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 These pretzels are making me thirsty!
So anyway, tite nikade apixai. So that's why the apixai is not sooner, because it's not the focus. Ti, we could think of that as the topic. Te nikade, so early, that is the focus. And apixai, that the fact that he's arrived, that he's here, is presupposed by the question. But then he says, taumazdo. He starts with the verb, and then he goes with the hopos. So the broad focus here is taumazdo. I wonder, hopos. And then the hopos is like hoti or something, is just a conjunction. So that's fine. Then what happens? Well, then we have another clause with its own word order that's independent of the taumazdo, hopos part. So we have etele sesui, starting with the verb, ho tu desmoterio pulax. So the guard of the prison guard. So I wonder at the fact that the prison guard wanted to obey you or listen to you or do what you asked, which is to come to see me here in the prison. The most important thing, again, is this broad focus. So as we discussed before, with a syntactic approach, we would expect the ho tu desmoterio pulax, that's the subject, to come right after the verb. And yet there's the sui that's put in between. That's interesting. And then there's the yubakusai. That's just, that verb which would has got to come somewhere. So at the end seems to be good enough. But the sui, that goes with the yubakusai. Could it not be etelesen ho tu desmoterio pulax yubakusai sui? It certainly could be. So the sui coming earlier, one thing we know is that enclitics, they like when they can to come earlier in the phrase, that's for sure. Is there a reason when it comes to emphasis that could be valuable? Yeah, because what is he amazed at? Is he amazed at the pulax himself? Not really. It's more that he's amazed at what the pulax is doing, wanting to you. That he wants it. That's the emphatic part. Tele sesui. And then the rest is kind of given. Ho tu desmoterio pulax. Yubakusai. So that is an explanation for why the word order is the way it is in this sentence. So we had to more emphasize things towards the beginning. Taumazdo to start with, broad focus. Then etelese, another broad focus. Enclitic in second position makes a lot of sense, even though it's separated from the verb that rules it, if you will, which is the hypakusai. But despite all that, it still makes sense that we would contrast the want to you. You know, what? You want to hear you? Like you? Crito, of all people? Anyway, that is a simple analysis of how we may interpret the word order in a sentence like this one. When it comes to the left periphery, we can add a few other things called settings and themes. Settings can be time expressions. Tote, for example, then, that's an easy one. Tote, and hoi, while, those are pretty easy. You could also have something like en datoi epionti ke moni, during that winter. Tamen atenaion kai lakadaimonion he shukaz de diaten ekekerian. So we could have a phrase like en hoi or en ke moni in the winter, epi, when or since, or genitive absolute. Pratontos de tu guru tauta, as Cyrus was doing that. Now, interestingly though, that whole setting there, that's its own phrase, its own clause, isn't it? Its own little sentence. And where's the verb? Pratontos. Rephrase, that could be something like prate hokyrus tauta. Verb, subject, and then the rest, the kind of object. Again, I'm mixing that syntactic approach with the pragmatic approach terminology-wise, but I still think it's useful and it really stands out. You really see the verb in the most basic kind of ancient Greek sentence or phrase very frequently at the front, unless there's some need to emphasize something before it, something more importantly than it. So it's setting. Another thing that's really interesting are themes. Well, what are themes? Themes, that's something that can come even before the setting in this left periphery of the sentence. For example, proxenos de kai menon. As for these two guys, e peperi sin humeteroi men euergetai, he meteroi de strategoi. That's the setting, epeper, right? Since. Notice again, within that phrase, with the epeper, esin, verb at the front, and then the subject that follows it. Or if you will, the verb and then a given topic or an expected topic, a continuous topic, something that is easy to understand as following from that simple verb esin, they are, or rather, broad focus may be a better way to think about it. This is just descriptive. It's narratively descriptive without further context. And finally, pensate autus deuro. Verb, and then a given topic is the autus deuro. One more item on the right periphery is something called a tail. So tails are afterthoughts, almost as if one wanted to mention it earlier but didn't get around to it until the end. An example here, Tigaruk egageactes asies ethnos epiten helada xerxes. And honestly, I think that feels very nice. I feel like it really should be there at the end, that final little tail, xerxes. Otherwise, it could, like a given topic, have come after agage xerxes. But the ectes asies ethnos epiten helada, why is it earlier? Well, it's more important. Like xerxes, it's left as far to the end as possible. Thus, it's worth mentioning, but only very minimally so. Thus, the whole structure that we get, the clauses with periphery, we have a theme, as for this thing. And then you can have a setting, time expression, connector of some kind, genitive absolute, and then your clause with all of the broad focus and narrow focus formulae that we saw earlier, followed finally by a tail. So can this pragmatic approach be applied to Latin instead of the syntactic approach, like I talked about in the previous video? Well, it certainly can be. It seems that these aren't mutually exclusive, at least that's my opinion, that the word order, the unemphasized word order that I demonstrated in the previous video about the Latin word order, that is still valid. And then when we see things that are moved into different positions for emphatic reasons, the emphatic approach helps us understand, I would say with a greater degree of sophistication, exactly why this or that might be there. Nevertheless, I think the syntactic approach is still perfectly acceptable and valid for understanding a totally neutral Latin word order, and from there, understanding why that word order is so frequently disobeyed. Another very interesting subject to mention are, of course, the particles. In fact, there's a lot more about word order and a lot more details we could talk about today, but I don't want to go too long in this video. But the particles, oh, they're so interesting. And there's something called Wacker-Nagel's law, which helps us understand how the particles are arranged. Well, what kind of particles? Well, in the first position, these particles, well, they're all postpositive, but the first type are forward-linking connective particles, especially men and often te, followed by backward-linking connective particles, de, gar, un. Then other particles that are emphatic, like de and ge, etc. Indefinite pronouns, like tis, ti, and so forth. And finally, personal pronouns, me, se, mu, su, and so forth. So here's an example. Alogia mengardetis painetai diatuton. So we have men gardetis, following that order. Men is of the 5 locations possible. Men is in the first, and you have gar, de, one of those emphatic ones, then tis, indefinite pronoun, following just that order. So we couldn't put those pronouns into a different order, not in a string like that. That's where they should be. They're all in the second position, but within that second position, they follow that sequence. And here's another. Eun tise tuton aresque. So ti, the indefinite whatever, followed by se. The se comes after that. We wouldn't see them reversed. I tried to put all 5 categories into one sentence, so I wrote this. Piros mengardetisoi, boetese pasastas emeras, polemios detisu. I'm not saying this is a beautiful sentence, but I wanted to put all of the positions, all the 5 positions there, at least one example of each. So min in that first, gar in the second, de, that's one from the third group, tis, that's the indefinite pronoun, and sui, one of the enclitic personal pronouns. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go into any more examples today, but take these principles, open up, your favorite classical Greek literature, Koine too, if you want. I haven't done much Koine analysis with all this, but I think it can hold up pretty well, especially for Atticizing Koine. And you'll probably find a lot of this still holds true. I hope this was enough to get you started. It is a very complex complex argument, complex subject. Oh gosh. This is a very complex field of study. It's really, really interesting. I definitely recommend a number of the sources that I made mention of here today. They're worth looking at in detail if you really want to learn more about this. And it's very, very helpful to know at least what we talked about today, because then when you read the literature, you can feel when these authors are emphasizing one bit of information over another. Thank you so much for watching. Karin Eccl, and we'll see you next time. Es autis, hygienete.